Thank you very much. I'm sure you all know that same-sex marriage is now legal in England and Wales, and in Scotland, but not yet in Northern Ireland. The battle to secure the legalization of same-sex marriage ended the last major discrimination against LGBTI people in law. The last major legal discrimination. But, important though that same-sex marriage bill was and is, it's not equality. We now have two separate marriage laws. Firstly, there's the 1949 Marriage Act, which is for opposite-sex couples only, for heterosexual men and women. And then we have the 2013 Marriage Act, which is for same-sex couples only, for lesbian and gay couples and partners. So we have, in effect, a system of legal segregation in marriage law. A system of legal segregation where there's one marriage law for straight people, another one for LGBTI ones. Now that is quite clearly not equality. There are also various discriminations in that same-sex marriage law. For example, if you're married under the 1949 Marriage Act and you're a straight couple, if your partner dies and he or she has been contributing to their pension, you can inherit, in most cases, all of their pension contributions back to the very first year when they began contributing. But if you're a same-sex couple, either in a same-sex civil marriage or a same-sex civil partnership, by law, you can only inherit your deceased partner's pension contributions going back to 2005, and in some cases, 1988. So, for example, if you'd been contributing to your pension since 1960 and you die, if you're in a same-sex marriage, your surviving partner can only legally be entitled to the last few years of pension contributions, i.e. since 2005, or in some cases back to 1988, but certainly not back to 1960. So in other words, your surviving partner would lose 20 plus years of pension contributions. So that's why we say that the Same-Sex Marriage Act is a very important advance, but it's not equality and it's not perfect. Also, of course, we still have a ban on opposite-sex civil partnerships. As you know, the government in 2005 made it possible for same-sex couples to have a civil partnership. This legislation was framed to stop the bid for same-sex marriage, to offer same-sex couples an alternative called civil partnerships. But under this legislation, only same-sex partners can have a civil partnership. Opposite-sex partners cannot. They are still banned even to this day. And that is another form of discrimination that myself and many others think is wrong. We believe that both civil marriage and civil partnerships should be open to everyone without discrimination. So civil marriage now is open to everyone regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. But civil partnerships are not. So the irony is that for many decades, same-sex couples were prohibited from getting married, but now they've got the right to marry, and they've also got the right to have a civil partnership. Whereas straight couples only have the option of marriage. They can't have a civil partnership. So you can see that there is other unfinished business even for straight couples. What about the other issues? I said that same-sex marriage was the last great legal discrimination to be overturned. It's true that we have many fantastic equality laws in this country, most notably the Equality Act of 2010. But written into all of these laws are limited qualified exemptions for religious organizations. Not just places of worship, but also faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, shelters for the homeless, and so on. In certain circumstances, if a religious organization can show that it is necessary for the purposes of upholding their, quote, religious ethos, they are allowed to discriminate against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people. They can discriminate them in terms of employment, refusing to hire an LGBTI person or even sack them, and they can discriminate against LGBTI people in terms of providing services. They can say, we're providing this service, but we don't want to provide it to LGBTI people. Now, of course, I respect the right of religious people to hold the view that homosexuality is wrong. I'm disappointed that they hold that view, and of course, many religious people do not. Many support equality. But nevertheless, having said that, I don't think it's right that just because you hold a religious point of view, that you should be exempt from the law and be able to discriminate. So I think it's time that those loopholes in the equality laws were closed to ensure that religious organizations, like everyone else, are not permitted to discriminate on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. Another big issue, which is of course relevant to you at school, is that the research shows that more than half of all young LGBTI kids have been bullied at school, ranging from name-calling and teasing to threats and actual physical violence in the classroom or the playground. Over half. And yet, less than half of all schools have an anti-bullying program that specifically addresses homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bullying. Less than half. And again, the anecdotal evidence is that anti-gay bullying is worse in faith schools, and faith schools do the least to combat it. No wonder the rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and even attempted suicide among young LGBTI kids is much, much higher than for the average population. These kids often also suffer rejection by their parents. They may be going home to a situation where their parents reject and disown them. One of the biggest causes of youth homelessness in Britain is young LGBTI kids who've been thrown out of their homes by their bigoted parents and end up living on the streets. That's shocking in this day and age. So what I would say is that we need to do much more. Every school, including yours, needs to have an anti-bullying program that specifically addresses bullying on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. Every school needs to ensure that it has sex and relationship education that includes sex and relationship education about LGBTI issues and relationships. Every school needs to have HIV prevention and awareness education that's inclusive of LGBTI kids. Every school needs to have equality and diversity lessons which challenge all forms of prejudice. Not just homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, but racism, sexism, prejudice against disabled people or travelers or ex-prisoners or refugees or immigrants. Those equality and diversity lessons are crucial to create a safe space for all pupils in schools and crucial to create a cohesive society where young people grow up to not be prejudiced against others who are different, but to be understanding, accepting, and supportive. If we want to live in a harmonious society where we all get along, prejudice needs to be challenged. And we all know that no child is born prejudiced. No child comes out of the womb with bigoted views and opinions. That's learned behaviour. Learned from other young people, and sometimes, shockingly, learned from adults, parents and other adult figures around. So, by changing the nature of education, by making inclusive sex and relationship education and equality and diversity lessons a part of every school's curriculum, I believe we can not only make LGBTI kids feel safer and valued and reduce the levels of anxiety, depression and self-harm, but we can also help create a more convivial atmosphere for all pupils of all sexualities. A related issue is that about 1/3 of all LGBTI people in this country have been victims of homophobic, biphobic or transphobic hate crimes. Over 1/3, or about 1/3. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Nearly 1 million LGBTI people have been victims of hate crimes in this country. And again, if we have those equality and diversity lessons in schools, if we have inclusive sex and relationship education, then it's much more likely that people will grow up and won't think that bullying and hate crime is acceptable. There's also the question of the unequal interpretation of the law. It's great to have all these new laws, but it's also pivotally important that they are interpreted correctly and enforced rigorously. Some of you may know of the example of Sheikh Abdullah al-Faisal, who I think in about 2004 incited people to go and kill Jews and Hindus. He was promptly arrested, put on trial, convicted, and jailed for 9 years. Around the same time, another Islamist extremist, Imam Abdul Muhid, advocated the killing of homosexuals. He wasn't even put on trial. He wasn't even prosecuted, despite there being 4 witnesses to his explicit incitement to go and kill homosexuals. So you can see why many of us feel that the law is not always enforced in a fair, impartial manner. Some of you may also be familiar with the 8 Jamaican reggae and dancehall singers like Buju Banton, Elephant Man, Vybz Kartel, T.O.K., Capleton, and so on. These singers have all put out tracks advocating the killing of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Buju Banton's song Boom Bye Bye says, "Take a gun, shoot a queer in the head, pour acid over his body, and burn him alive." That singer has never been prosecuted. In fact, successive Home Secretaries, Labour and Conservative, have given him and others work permits and visas to come and perform in this country. Now, I'm certain that if someone was advocating killing black people, Jews, Muslims, or other minorities, they would have never ever been given a visa and work permit. So why the double standards? Another issue is that although there's no longer a lifetime ban on gay and bisexual men donating blood, it's now been reduced to 12 months, that's still unnecessary. The reasoning is that obviously some, and I emphasize some gay and bisexual men are at higher risk of infections like HIV and hepatitis B. That's true. But what the blood service does is make a blanket generalization about all gay and bisexual men. Not all are at risk. You know, you can have safer sex and not risk yourself or your partner in any way. You know, there's no danger, and therefore no danger that if you donate blood, you will infect the blood supply. Now, I agree that protecting the blood supply and ensuring patient safety is absolutely paramount. But you don't need a 12-month deferral period. Under this rule, any man who's had oral or anal sex with another man in the preceding 12 months is barred from giving blood. Even if he used a condom correctly and it didn't break, and even if he now tests HIV negative. That's a non-scientific, non-medically justified exclusion. The exclusion period, the deferral period, could realistically be reduced to 1, 3, or 6 months, depending on the individual circumstances. All the blood service needs to do is, in the case of men who've had sex with men, is ask a few additional questions. So, for example, myself and many other gay men are vaccinated against hepatitis B. So there's no risk at all that we'll pass that on. You know, many gay and bisexual men are in monogamous long-term relationships where both partners have tested negative. Others who perhaps have more than one partner or have had in the past, they always use condoms. The condoms don't break. They test HIV negative. Their blood is safe to give. The final issue I'd mention is the treatment of LGBTI refugees fleeing persecution in homophobic countries like Iran, Uganda, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Jamaica, and so on. At the moment, the rate of refusal for LGBTI refugees is much higher than average. On a first application, a much higher than average number of LGBTI refugees are refused compared to political, religious, and ethnic refugees. We often find that LGBTI refugees are placed in detention, in asylum detention centres, which are essentially a prison by another name. You know, how shocking is that we take people who have fled terrible persecution, perhaps themselves been imprisoned, they come here and seek a place of refuge, and we put them in an asylum detention centre, which is, to all intents and purposes, very similar to a prison. We also the government often puts them on fast track, which means they only have about 2 or 3 weeks to prepare their asylum case and their appeal. But of course, if you are in an asylum detention centre, your freedom of movement, your capacity to prepare your case, to gather the evidence, is greatly diminished. It's not really possible. Plus, if you're on fast track, you've got such a small window of opportunity to get the evidence. So maybe you might have been tortured in Uganda or Iran. You've got to get the evidence to show that. And that takes weeks and months. But if you're on fast track, you've only got a few days or 2 or 3 weeks at the maximum. That is not fair. Also, when it comes to funding, the government, or successive governments, both Labour and Conservative, have cut the funding available to solicitors who do asylum cases. On the amount of money available, no asylum seeker can prepare a proper case. It's just impossible. The money is not there. And so if you look at it in a cynical way, you could say that by cutting the funding for asylum cases and by putting people in detention or on fast track, the government is deliberately weighting the system to fail as many refugees as possible. Not just LGBTI refugees, but all refugees. And then there is the issue, the particular issue with LGBTI refugees. Increasingly, the government will dispute the fact that they're lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or intersex. Even where they produce love letters or, membership of gay clubs and bars or photographs of them on gay rights protests, joint bank accounts, all the kinds of things that a person in a relationship might have. Even so, very often the Home Office suggests this is all faking it. This is all, a fraud. So the question is, how are you supposed to prove that you're gay? What's happening now is that many LGBTI refugees are so desperate and so distressed that they're being disbelieved that they're photographing or filming themselves having sex with their partners. And this, for many of them, is deeply, deeply offensive and shocking. Many of them come from very conservative cultures where any display of affection, let alone nakedness or sex, is strictly taboo. Yet despite they feel this, they feel obliged to make these videos or take these photographs in a desperate bid to prove to the adjudicator that they are a genuine gay, lesbian, bisexual or transgender person. I'll give you one really shocking example. About a year or so ago, one man did this. He filmed himself having anal sex with his partner. Because he thought this was the only thing the judge would accept. This would be proof that he was genuinely gay. But unfortunately, he was the penetrated partner, and when he was being penetrated, he didn't have an erection. So the judge turned around and said, I see the evidence you presented, but when you're being penetrated, you haven't got an erection. You're obviously not turned on. You can't be gay. As if gay men are supposed to have permanent erections. So you can see the kind of obstacles that are put in the way of genuine refugees trying to demonstrate and prove their fear of persecution and the fact that they are genuine LGBTI people. The final point I want to just make is about the global situation. As you know, there are nearly 80 countries around the world where homosexuality is still totally illegal in all circumstances, with penalties ranging from just a few years imprisonment right up to life imprisonment and even execution in a handful of countries. In about 6 or so Islamist countries, still, if you're gay and there's evidence that you had gay sex, you can be put to death. You may have seen the shocking images of ISIS in Syria and Iraq throwing gay men off the top of tall buildings. And in one case, the man survived the fall, and then he was stoned to death in front of the crowd. But ISIS is not the only one. Saudi Arabia has the death penalty for gay sex. So does Iran, Yemen, Mauritania, Sudan, and a few other countries. In 2 countries, 2 Commonwealth countries, Pakistan and Nigeria, you can, in certain regions, be subject to Sharia law where there is a death penalty for homosexuality. Pakistan and Nigeria are members of the Commonwealth, yet they're allowed to get away with it. The Commonwealth itself has a very poor record. I mentioned nearly 80 countries still outlaw homosexuality in all circumstances, even between consenting adults in private. More than half of those countries are members of the Commonwealth. Over 40 Commonwealth countries out of 53 have a total ban on homosexuality. 7 of them have life imprisonment in countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Guyana, Sierra Leone, the Gambia, and so on. Life imprisonment. Yet we have a Commonwealth Charter which guarantees equal rights and non-discrimination to every Commonwealth citizen. Despite that, most Commonwealth countries, 80% of Commonwealth countries, have policies of severe persecution of LGBTI people. You probably know that in the last 2 or 3 years there's been a huge global backlash with increasingly repressive anti-gay measures by many countries. Well, it's in fact only about 15 or 20 countries out of 193. But still it's quite shocking. You know, Russia has a new law prohibiting the so-called promotion of homosexuality, which means any kind of advocacy or defense of gay rights A man was arrested on this law for holding a sign in the street saying homosexuality is normal. Teachers all across Russia are being sacked from their jobs, not because they discussed homosexuality, but just simply because they're gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And that is being supported and orchestrated by the Russian Orthodox Church, as well as Putin's political party. The Brunei regime, the Sultan of Brunei, about a year ago announced that he was introducing Sharia law, including the stoning to death of gay people and of women who have sex outside of marriage. The Gambia and Nigeria have just in recent months or so introduced draconian new laws prohibiting even the advocacy of gay equality and the membership of gay and lesbian organizations. So it's been widened beyond gay sex to virtually anything that could be construed as aiding and abetting, encouraging or endorsing same-sex relations. You may know that Uganda attempted to introduce a draconian bill with the death penalty for repeat homosexual offenders. Fortunately, that was eventually dropped under international pressure, and fortunately the revised version was eventually annulled by the Ugandan courts. But the bill has come back in a new form. In countries like Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, and so on, some of the former Soviet republics, there are increasing pressures and calls for new legislation to clamp down on what they call the promotion of homosexuality. There are calls in many countries to recriminalize homosexuality. So the global trend is forward, but there is a very substantial backlash. And it means that in many countries, LGBTI people live in fear. So just last week, I had an email from the LGBT group in Azerbaijan. They were saying that the threats they're receiving from the government and the prospect of a new draconian law, plus the death threats they're receiving from far-right groups, are so great that they have to close down. And they're going to leave the country because it's no longer safe. They fear being killed simply for providing welfare advice to vulnerable LGBTI people and simply for campaigning for gay equal rights. I said it's a backlash in about 15 or 20 countries. Overall, the global trend is forward for LGBT rights. So when you think about it, even before Britain legalized same-sex marriage, Argentina and Uruguay did so. Just a couple of weeks ago, Vietnam lifted the ban on same-sex marriage, and there are now moves to legalize it. A parliamentary report about the same time in Nepal came out with a recommendation that gay and lesbian couples should be able to marry. So you get a flavour that in many countries, indeed many unlikely countries, LGBTI people are making gains. This is one of the great social movements for human emancipation. We've achieved an enormous amount in this country in the last 10 or 15 years, and globally we are beginning to achieve much more in many, many countries. There will come a time, I'm confident, when gay people the world over will live in equality and non-discrimination. But in many countries, that is going to be a long time yet. Nevertheless, there are brave activists, gay and straight, in many, many countries who are pushing for reform. And I'd pay tribute to all those very brave LGBTI activists and their straight friends and allies who are championing the right of people to love who they wish. That's what it's all about. It's not about imposing homosexuality on anyone. It's about simply saying that gay people ought to be able to live their lives as free and equal citizens without the threat of arrest or mob violence. Thank you.